Michael Hanna. What is the power of story? Wasn't that beautiful? I was about to say something just flip and easy, which is story is everything, but instead I'll say something sophisticated and deep. Story is everything. It's everything. It's only very recently that I started thinking about story. I read a screenplay book. I've mentioned this before. I'm not going to go into too much details. I'd read the classic screenwriting and Making Good Script. Great. These are great books on how to write movie screenplays. Screenplay, something, I forget. But then I read a book called Story, written by a really unpleasant guy. But once I read Story, somebody's going to tell me the name of this guy. I can't remember. I realized that, you know what, I'm going to tell myself the name of this. That's what I'm going to do. I'm not helpless. I'm not a raft floating down river. I have an iPhone. And I have books. So the person who wrote Story, his name is, hold for the drum roll. Probably could have gotten faster waiting for somebody, and I'm going to have to... Oh, come on. I have 50 books that are downloaded in here. All right, somebody's going to beat me to it. There it is. Robert It's coming up. It's coming down. It's coming in now. Coming through NowCon. Come on. Robert McKee. Looks like it. Can't get the page up. Yeah, Robert, it looks like McKee. Anyway, sorry about that. He wrote a book called, thank you, Robert McKee. Wrote a book called Story. And he said so many things. It's not well written. It's all over the place, I think. It's funny because his book about story has no real story to it. However, there's not a book I've ever highlighted more than this book. And he says things in the book that just shocked me. They just... I mean, I've written probably 7 or 8 full-length movie screenplays, and I had no idea what I was doing before I read this book. None. I was just hacking through it. I didn't have a map. I didn't have a destination. Didn't have a plan. I'm just hacking through it with a machete. He would say things like, if the emotional charge of a scene is not the opposite of what it was at the beginning of the scene, then that scene doesn't need to be in the movie. That scene needs to be cut. What? Every single scene, the end of the scene has to be different emotionally charged than the beginning of the scene? Yeah. That's a lot of work. Yeah, it is a lot of work. That's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's true. If something doesn't happen in that scene, that's the definition of happen. Something changes. If something doesn't happen in that scene is just dead air. Get out of the script. Wow. Wow. And 100 others like that. 100 others. Talk about the different kinds of stories and the, you know, and the idea, simple things. It may seem obvious, but that weren't obvious. Not to me anyway. The idea that you have these... See, I mentioned earlier that it's hard for a writer to build conflicts into his story. He doesn't want to build conflicts into his story. He wants everything to sail along and make your point and have the good guys win and the bad guys are vanquished and the orcs get killed and that's it. But in order to make the character interesting, you have to put him in danger and you have to have a dark night of the soul. And to make him human, you have to have him do bad things, not just good things, because people do bad things. And then he has to overcome it, feel guilty, all this other stuff. But one of the simple little things he said was, when you have the protagonist come in contact with the antagonist, every single time they come into conflict as the story goes on, the stakes have to get higher. And that's an obvious thing to say, but that's how you know it's brilliant, because it is so obvious. It never occurred to me. But it's really true. It's like the stakes have to get higher. Every time there's a confrontation, it has to get more intense. Can't get less intense because otherwise it's boring. It's going downhill. So I applied many of these things to big bad problems. I have this first confrontation with the you know, the government agents, and it's kind of just sort of an intimidation thing. It's kind of a warning, and then there's a attempt on their lives, and then there's a serious attempt on their lives, and then they take some lives, and it's like, every time these two forces meet, it gets ratcheted up. It's ratcheting up the tension. Brilliant. It's brilliant. It's brilliant, 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 brilliant. But we're talking about the small story, you know, small s story. How do you make a story? How do you make a screenplay into a story? There's a big S story. That's, by the way, that's another thing. He talks about little T truth and big T truth. And he says one of the most boring, useless, stupid movies you can make is a movie that is an absolute slice of life. You see the character gets up in the morning and maybe he's a heroin addict. So he walks over to the sink and he brushes his teeth and the water that comes out of the tap is dirty because he hasn't turned on the sink in 4 days. And he doesn't have any toothpaste, so he brushes his teeth with, baking soda or whatever and so on. It's like, okay, this is gritty. But he says if all you do is tell the story of this guy's real life, that's not a story. That's not truth. That's small t truth. Yes, it's true. That's what it looks like. But that's not the bigger truth that you have to go for. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to do a show business show was because I'm against all of this in politics. The left news media doesn't report the truth because of the big truth. That's horrific in journalism. We're not talking about journalism. Everything has to be bigger. It has to be focused. It has to be concentrated. You have to make a point. Contrast. And so he said, if you do something that's just a slice of life, I get up, I go to my job in the insurance company. It's not particularly boring. That's not realism. It's not interesting. Something's got to happen. And so when you start thinking about story, you have to ask yourself, when we pick up this character, this protagonist, why are we picking him up now? The first scene in Star Wars, go back to something everybody's seen. It's just nice to talk about Star Wars, not because it's the best example, because everybody's seen it. That's an awfully good example, I have to say. So when do you first see Luke Skywalker? Well, he's standing out there alone, and he's on this planet, he's by himself, and he's got these two older aunt and uncle, and he's obviously unhappy, and he's restless, and he wants to go off to college, basically. So why did we meet Luke there? Why didn't we meet Luke 3 years earlier? Why didn't we meet Luke 2 years later? Why did we meet Luke Skywalker when we meet Luke Skywalker? We meet Luke Skywalker at the time and place we meet him because that's when his adventure begins. I know it seems obvious, but it's not obvious. That's when his adventure begins. If you come in earlier, it's dead air. If you come in later, you've missed something important. That's when his adventure begins. These are the elements of story that make up story, but the big story is a much more interesting idea. The big story is, why are we telling the story? And when you get into this, you get into what is it about story, and the more you think about story, the more you begin to realize that everything is story. Everything is story. We don't speak the English language. We use the English language to tell the language of story. We tell stories. It's nothing but story, and it's got nothing to do with the movies. The movies are just a form of storytelling. I mean, seriously, what happens when Dad comes home at the end of the day? Honey, how was your day? And we start the story. Right? We don't get a PowerPoint presentation. We get a story. We get a story that's told. And as people get, this is second nature for them. Honey, how was your day? Well, I was this and this, and I went to work, and so yelled at me again, and they'll tell it in such a way that it builds to a climax, and there's an antagonist and a protagonist, and there's forces of evil, and it's what we do. Children learn through nothing but stories. All of the books we ever learned were just stories. Even the sort of educational books were story. The Bible's nothing but stories. Jesus didn't stand there with a chalkboard and all right, here's why you need to be kind to other people. Even people who you don't think are going to be kind. There's goodness in everybody. Just take my word for it. It doesn't say there's goodness in everybody. Believe me, I'm the Son of Man. Just take my word for it. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan, a despised person who shows kindness. And everybody can relate to that story. And the prodigal son is a story. They're all stories. It's how we communicate. It's an efficient way. Here's what it is. And it's a great thing about the show. One of the reasons why I like it so much is I learn a lot from the show. It just hit me like a thunderbolt. What a story is information conveyed with emotion. It's both. It's the head and the heart together. It's information conveyed with emotion. So it's not just the rudder of information, and it's not just the propeller of emotion. It is directed emotion where you learn something. And that's what story is. And so if everything is a story, and it is, then you got to tell a good story. I mean, I have to tell you, and I don't mean this to sound, it's certainly not false modesty, this is genuine modesty, and I certainly don't want to cast any aspersions on any of you. I know this sounds like I'm going to say something awful, but I mean this from the bottom of my heart. It's amazing to me. It's amazing to me that people watch the Stratosphere Lounge. I never get over it. I'll look at YouTube. It's like 5,000 people sat in front of me just gassing for 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And they keep watching it seriously. And then like I said, it's not false modesty. False modesty is trying to say, well, I'm not really. The reason people watch the Stratosphere Lounge, it happens. And the reason has to be because I can tell a story. I can make things interesting. And when I say I make them interesting, what is it about it that's interesting? Now, I'm conveying a lot of information here, but the fact that there's no computer graphics, I don't have things exploding behind me, I don't have naked chicks walking around, God knows the numbers would go way up if I did. Well, what is it about this 2.5 hour thing we do every week or every other week or whatever? What is it about it? I'm telling stories, and I'm making them interesting because it's information that is interesting, but I'm telling it in such a way that the heart gets connected, that it's an emotional reaction to it. And that means there's a certain amount of inflection, there's a certain amount of pause, there's humor, there's all this other stuff that makes it interesting when it wouldn't necessarily be interesting otherwise. Somebody could go through the highlighted parts of story and just read them to you in a monotone. You'd take 3 minutes of that and you'd be out of here. So it's all about story. And when you get right down to it, it's an extremely efficient way to convey information, because information has to be processed by the human brain, and it has to be connected to, and it has to be interesting. And it's not just the data that's interesting, although the data is interesting. It's got to have an emotional appeal. Now we get the feedback, and all of you very kind and talking about why you like the show, but I have to scroll down because I don't want to miss the name again. I hate it when that happened. David Reel just said it's like talking with a friend, Bill. And we went to we used to do the show on the stage, and now we do this because it's better, looks better. It didn't work on the stage. I can use this stage, the Stratosphere Lounge stage, right over there when we get to guests. But if it feels like a friend, it's because I am a friend. I mean it. I mean it. You can't fake this kind of thing. The reason I may feel like a friend and that I've been talking to you personally is because I am. I'm not one of these people who feels better than other people. I don't feel better than my audience. I feel less than my audiences. I understand that right now, as of this second, there's 156 people watching this live. There'll be probably 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people watching it at some point in the future on YouTube. And every single one of you watching this knows hundreds of things more than I do. And I am astonished by this. I learned so much, and I have an enormous amount of respect. And the idea that people are paying me money to do this, that I'm living this life and have this incredible studio because of other people parting with their hard-earned money, it's a constant source of amazement to me, amazement and joy and pride. So if it seems like I'm talking to you as a friend, it's because I am, and I'm not trying to blow sunshine at you. I mean, I know it's a one-way street, but I treat the people on the other side of that camera like they're my friends, because I feel like they are. They've helped me enormously, not just financially or professionally, but emotionally and personally. I've said this many times. When I started getting the feedback from eject, I had to step up and become a better person than I was, because I had to live up to people's I had to step up to their expectations of me. I had to be the kind of person that they thought I was. And it's been wonderful. And when I go on the road and get to meet people in person, I think I said it last time or a couple times ago, I was in Baton Rouge last, and people just come up to me and say, sometimes I couldn't get out of bed without your work. I mean, it makes me cry. It's astonishing. It's lovely. So it's a feedback loop. It's a feedback loop. But anyway, the reason the Stratosphere Lounge works is because it's all stories. And the worst produced show in television on the internet is part of the story. And it's a running gag, and it covers the errors by laughing at it. And I'm not laughing at you, and I'm not being snarky about it. I'm laughing at me, because I will say that the Ustream is not a particularly robust or user-friendly platform. It does seem to change every single week, and every single time I think I have it sorted out, I don't. But I keep making the same mistakes with the muting and stuff. I keep thinking I got it understood when I don't. So these are running gags. It's part of the whole deal. So the story is everything, and when you see a movie that's boring, even though you've got $100 million of special effects in it, it's because there's no story. And I have to tell you, I love Superman. I think Superman is heartwarming, tear-jerking story. The Superman myth and legend is America in a nutshell. But I didn't like the previous Superman movie, and I didn't like the last one either. The last 2/3 of the last Superman movie is an indestructible, immortal CG character punching another indestructible, immortal CG character through trains and through walls and through bank vaults and all that other stuff. I've never been so bored in my life. Ever been so bored in my life as watching Superman battle General Zod in that last thing. Oh, I'm going to knock you through a building. Oh, I'm going to bang you through a wall. Oh, I'm going to smack you with a train. Well, I'll smack you with a ship. You're both indestructible. Neither of you can be killed. Until the final thing when somebody's going to get somebody in a headlock and break his neck or something like that, right? And it's ridiculous, and it's dull. And the reason it's dull is there's no story there. There's no interesting part of the story. Now, obviously, go back over a lot of, 100 episodes coming up. There's a lot of ground I tread twice, but not everybody gets to watch everything. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to say it again because I think it's so important. You should write what you know, and if you don't know what you're writing about, you should probably do a little research. Mitchell and Webb have a couple of sketches where there are these two guys that are writers that don't understand it, so they write a medical drama, and it's like, looks like he's feeling poorly. Nurse, bring the medicine. It's hilarious. It just goes to show you what bad writing is about. But the point I want to make, and I've made before, is this. An audience may not know that the writer doesn't know what he's talking about because they don't know what the subject is either. So they may not know that the writer doesn't know. But when the writer does know, they know. And for me, the classic example, as I've mentioned before, was Crimson Tide. I know a little bit about sub-combat. I wasn't on subs, but I know enough about it to know what sounds about right. And when these guys come out and it's an authenticating the message, and it's like on the 1MC spin-up tubes 1 through 24. It's an odd language. On the spin-up tubes 1 through 24, but that's what they say. And it sounds different and unusual. And when they come out of the room with the encrypted thing and they're holding it up in the air, in the plastic thing, it's like, why are they holding it in the air? They're holding it in the air because they have to hold it in the air, because if they don't, somebody could switch the message, you see? And when you see that kind of chrome, that's what we generally call these kind of details. When you see that kind of chrome, I said, I don't know who wrote this, but this guy knows what's going on. Turns out the advisor on Crimson Tide was a former commander of the Alabama. And it shows. And so while audiences may not know it's missing, when it's there, they feel it. And that's what I aim for. One example I've used before, too, is there's a... the script is so far away from me now. I've been so concentrating on Big Bat, and I got Common Sense Resistance between them. But there's a scene in Aurora where it's a visually dramatic scene where an astronaut gets caught in these little transfer modules that go from these habitation models out there hundreds of yards away, and the thing's swinging. It's a centrifugal gravity thing, and the thing's on a cruise for a year and a half. So it doesn't care if these things are out there. It just reels it in when it needs a burn. But anyway, I had this scene that I liked a lot where these little transfer modules that go up and down to the main core, one of them sticks a couple feet away from the core, and that requires another guy to go up a ladder and to climb up this thing, rescue this person, and then carry her back down the ladder. She falls off, and these things are spinning, and it's like these giant things the size of a school bus or a semi-truck swinging past you. It's dramatically really interesting. It's great storytelling. It's a great visual. It's different. It's unusual. It's cool. But I could have just had him say, oh, it looks like the engine burned out, or oh, it looks like we got a problem with the thing. But the part of my head that is working on these things says, yeah, but if the motor were to burn out in real life, what would they do? Because you can't have a single point of failure like that. What would the backup be? Why is this dangerous? And I had to defeat 3 or 4 fail-safe things in a believable fashion. That took a lot of work. It took a lot of work. A lot of mental work. And I'd find, you know what, that doesn't make sense. That just doesn't make any sense. You can't do that. They'd obviously be doing this. So you have to do the work. But when you finally film something like this, people believe it. And I think the one thing that pulls people out of the story more than anything is oh, come on. How many times have you had that experience? You're in a movie theater, and the movie's okay, or maybe it's not okay, but whatever. You're kind of there, and you forget you're in a movie theater. And then somebody does something, one of the characters does something so stupid that you just go, oh, come on. And it's so stupid because no one would do that, but the writer needed it to happen so that he could make something else happen. It's just raw laziness. It's laziness. It's like any other form of laziness in any other trade. If somebody's supposed to put down six nails per foot and they put down 2 nails per foot, then it's laziness, and it shows. So the oh, come on moment has got to go. And good writers never let that creep into their thing. One of the things I like most about Big Bat Problems is that it's so cutting edge technology-wise, bleeding edge technology. They're using drones, they're using apps, they're using you know, these cheap Brookstone things. You just roll it into a room. But one of the great "oh come on" moments in history is a moment that is in a movie I like very much, which is the first Alien. And Sigourney Weaver's in the shuttle. She's ready to go. She's going to escape the alien. And then she hears a meow. And she goes, "Oh, Jonesy." And she goes back out after the cat. Look, I have cats. I might go after them. But I don't know. The point is, everybody in the audience aloud went, "Oh, come on. Come on. Don't be an idiot. Leave the cat." But she goes back for the cat. People just groaned. It wouldn't happen. You see a horror movie, and there's this, you know, scantily clad 19-year-old, and she's alone, and 15 of her closest friends have been brutally murdered, and she comes upon body after body after body after body after body, and she's in this house, this deserted house in the middle of nowhere, and she's getting the hell out of there. The car keys are in her hand, and she's walking past the open door down into the basement, and she hears a crash of something down in the basement, and she turns around with her flashlight because she wants to find out what's going on down there. And people say, "Come on! Anybody would run for the door. Anybody would run for the door." But no, the writer has decided that he's got to show the monster, which is what he has to do. But don't do that. Just don't do it. Don't take me out of the movie with your laziness. So that's the thing about the story. When people do things that that take you out of the movie, they take you out of the movie. Somebody just said, "I love Gravity." Sarjak said they love Gravity. I didn't love it at all. I thought it was spectacular to look at. But just as an example, I'll give you, actually, Gravity is a great example, because there are two things in Gravity. There's like a high-level thing in Gravity and a low-level thing in Gravity in terms of awareness and taking you out of the story. So I forget the details because I only saw it once. I thought I was going to want to see that movie 50 times. Only seen it once. No real desire to see it again. But in Gravity, her character is so awful, that they had to literally wallpaper over Sandra Bullock. They literally had to take like a roller and roll her face in paste and then stick some character stuff on her, which we're going to tell you about, not show you. We can't show you because she's in space, so we're going to tell you about it, and that'll develop sympathy for you. So it's the dead daughter, right? The daughter died. And she said something to the effect of, "I was driving when I got the news," something like this. And she says, "Anyway, what do you do?" He asked her, "What do you do when you're finished with a long shift in the emergency room?" And she says, "I go for a 2, 3, 4-hour drive." "You what?" "I go for a 3-hour drive because that's what I did when I heard the news my daughter died." And I said aloud, I was in a room full of people, said, "Oh, come on. Really? That's what you do after 14 hours in an operating room? Years after your daughter died, you spend 14 hours in an operating room, and when you're done, the first thing you do is drive for 3 or 4 hours because you got to get this out of..." I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I just said it out loud. I mean, when people look at me, it's like, "Nope, I don't believe it." That's how offensive that was to me. And a slightly less offensive one, but not much less offensive, is why couldn't she have been an astronaut, right? She's flying a Chinese capsule. She's doing all of these orbital mechanics stuff, which if she was an astronaut was still tax the imagination. But she wasn't an astronaut. She was a surgeon. Why was she a surgeon? She was a surgeon because she had to operate delicate parts and replace them on the Hubble or whatever it was. So you have to be a surgeon to put a bolt on something? I would have thought an engineer would be the guy you'd want in something like that. We're going to have you be a surgeon because you are the only person with the hands steady enough to undo a bolt? When has a surgeon ever had to undo a bolt in his life? What makes you think a surgeon can undo a bolt with bulky gloves on? You'd think an engineer would be the kind of person you'd want to have undoing bolts, or maybe an astronaut who'd been trained. But no, it's just laziness. We're going to make her a doctor. Why? Because then we could tell the story about how she was in the emergency room when her daughter died and she went for a long drive. Does her being a surgeon ever play into this movie in Gravity? Does the fact that she's a doctor, not an engineer, ever pay off? No, no. Does she ever need to be a surgeon in the movie? No, she doesn't. Laughing Hyena says, I was itching for her to die in gravity. I was too. By the time she's riding this thing on the outside of this thing, re-entering the atmosphere, I said, boy, I hope she doesn't make it. I hope she just burns up with the rest of it. And then, finally, after the 9th near-death experience she experiences, she finally gets back in the capsule lands, and the capsule lands in the only pond in the entire Asian continent, happens to land in the only lake in the Asian supercontinent, and she's going underwater, so now she has to escape again. She's only been through, what, 19 escapes? Now we have to have another one. We're going to lather on here. I wanted her to drown. I really did. I thought that'd be cool if she drowned at the end. That'd be ironic and kind of cool. It just, yeah, it's PAX 77-1 says it offends your intelligence. It does. It's an insult to my thinking ability. And it's also part of the same kind of thing. Here's an incredible, probably the most spectacular visual effects I've ever seen. I saw it in 3D, in IMAX, and the first 17 minutes is one take. It's breathtaking. I have not seen it again because it is so stupid. And I don't care. And George Clooney, he's an astronaut, and he's jet-setting around in this jetpack, his experimental jetpack. He's looping and rolling around and doing all these other things. Well, you know what, George? No, I don't believe it. And what is he talking about the first time you hear this astronaut? Is he talking about fixing up his cars? Oh, yeah, something banal and stupid like this, right? Like, oh, yeah, I'm going to get back. I'm going to be building my hot rod. Yeah, laying out the thing. Whatever he was saying, I have no memory of it. Well, I love to go faster. I've been working on hot rods. Blah, 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 blah. You ever listen to astronauts when they're in space working on EVAs? That's not what they say. So the question becomes, why did he say it? Why did the writer put this words into his mouth in the very beginning scene before the first of the collisions happen? Why did George Clooney go jet-setting around like a lunatic on an ATV talking about his cars or whatever the hell he was talking about? Do astronauts actually do that? No. Would the movie have been better if I believed he was an astronaut? Yes. So why do you have to have that conversation right now? Because we want to show what a character he is, see? What a character he is. Who cares? He's not a character. He's a cartoon. He's a joke. He's a joke. He's not a character. There's no depth to that character. He's a joke. Maybe if you were worried about your fuel supply later on, it's like, oh, you know, I don't know if we're going to have enough fuel. Well, maybe you shouldn't have been jerking around out there, riding around like a lunatic, because Mission Control would have grounded you for the rest of your life if they caught you doing that. And Sandra Bullock has to be... Is it better, really, that she doesn't know how to fly a capsule and then she flies the capsule? Is that more interesting? Because I don't find it more interesting. I find it ridiculous. I find it ridiculous. Sandra Bullock's extremely attractive and extremely sympathetic, and people like her. And they would have liked her if she was an astronaut. So this whole business about her being a doctor and the whole thing about Clooney being a character is a lazy, lazy, lazy writer throwing it in on the top. And the classic example I come to all the time is in Top Gun, right? Top Gun. These guys just, you know, they're out there fighting Joker in Top Gun school, and Maverick and Goose defeat their instructor by going through the hard floor. Basically, in order to avoid hitting the ground, we're going to say you cannot go below 6,000 feet, let's say. If you go below 6,000 feet, you've hit the ground, and the simulation's over. The fight's over. So they burst through the hard floor there, and then they shoot down Jester, and they're so proud of themselves. Ha ha, we got him, we got him. And you busted the hard floor. You not only didn't win the fight, you're not even just going home. You're court-martialed. You're done. And my friend Steve was an air traffic controller for many years in the Air Force, and I asked him this a long time ago. So then Maverick's coming back from having basically just committed a court-martial offense. And see, this is the kind of thing that makes me nuts. Because if Maverick had just come back and buzzed the tower and the guy had spilled his coffee and go, damn it, Maverick! Okay. But that's not what he does. He says, permission to buzz the tower. Negative, Maverick, the pattern is full. Maverick, what are you doing? Here we go. Oh. So he goes in and buzzes the tower after being denied permission to buzz the tower. And I asked my friend Steve what would happen to a guy in a case like that. I'll never forget his answer. He said, well, if a guy busted the pattern and buzzed the tower after being denied permission, then when the F-14 would have rolled to a stop, there would have been a couple of Humvees out there with MPs, and when the canopies came up, there'd be 4 guys with AR-15s or M4s leveled at him saying, get out of the cockpit now, get out of the cockpit, get on the ground now. And he would have been handcuffed, and he would have been taken away, and he would have gone to the brig for years and years and years. No one ever would have heard him again. And that's what would have happened to him. But the ultimate ridiculousness of it is not even that that's what would have happened. It's not even ridiculous that that didn't happen. What's ridiculous is that he did it in the first place, because this is now the laziness of the Hollywood writer in action. This is the laziness of the Hollywood writer. They're so lazy that they think in order to make this interesting, they have to make him a rebel who's standing up and, you know, who's busting clearances and mouthing off to his commanding officer. When in point of fact, those kind of things would get him grounded. Well, the writer will then say, well, the audience doesn't know that. That's true. But they also don't know how much better that character could have been if they had not been so lazy. How much more interesting he would have been if he was a tightly disciplined guy who was having issues with fear. Isn't that more interesting? Don't you think? Isn't it more interesting that a guy who's got this false bravado, who lives with this false bravado, oh, it's all about me, I'm all maverick, oh, look at me, you know. And then he's got this moment of fear, and then he kind of comes around. Isn't it more interesting if the guy was in fact just a ball of discipline who then was suddenly terrified? Don't you find that much more interesting than a guy who's filled with false bravado, a guy who was genuinely brave and genuinely disciplined, and now he's suddenly afraid? Don't you realize the internal conflicts that are so much more interesting there, and how much more terrifying that is to the guy, to the character? And Maverick's obviously a broken guy. I mean, he'd never get into fighter pilot school. He'd never even get into the school. And all of those defects of Maverick's character would have been washed out long before he ever soloed a jet. They would have found out about him a long time ago, and if he was still flying, he would have been flying C-17s. Not that there's any shame in flying C-17s, however. The thing about fighter pilots, it's so interesting, and I know our friend Viper's here, so I'll just say this as, as it comes out. The thing about fighter pilots and test pilots, just stay with fighter pilots for a minute, that's interesting is that they're not hot dogs on the ground. The thing that's interesting about a fighter pilot is, I know because I wanted to be one, and I would have been a hell of a good one too. I would have been a wizard of one. The thing about a fighter pilot is they're extremely aggressive. They're very aggressive, very confident, but at the same time they're tightly disciplined, professional men. That's so much more interesting than this kind of, that's what I hated about the Star Trek reboot with Kirk. He's a tight-fisted, rides a rebel. He rides his motorcycle, and he's fighting his way into Starfleet Command. The original James T. Kirk was described as a stack of books with legs. It's so much more interesting if Maverick is what a real fighter pilot is, which is a professional warrior, professional killer, who has all of this stuff under control. Then, if he has a crisis, and he's experiencing real fear, maybe for the first time, but certainly fear that's debilitating him for the first time, then his self-image, not just his self-image, his entire conception of self is destroyed. It's so much more interesting, and it's so much more believable, but that's hard. And in order to write a fighter pilot like that, with that kind of depth, you have to know fighter pilots. You have to know what kind of people they are. And you have to understand that the fact that this may not look as interesting as a guy, buzzing towers, it's not less interesting, it's more interesting. More interesting for him to be that guy, because there's more to reveal, right? There's more layers. More layers. The thing that's interesting about fighter pilots is the mix of restraint and aggression. Countless stories of guys. There was a guy I know for sure, a guy in Korea. I think it was one guy in an F-86, and he got bounced by something like 12 or 14 MiG-15s or MiG-17s, and he just rolled into them. He just said, I'm going to get them all. Unlike being a sub-skipper, which is a very different mentality, and I've done a lot of flight sims, and I've done a lot of sub-sims, and I've done a lot of sims. I've done a lot of sims. I'm a much better fighter pilot than I am a sub-skipper, because I don't have the patience for being a submarine captain. I don't have the patience to get into the room to get the shot. And I don't have the patience to dive when a destroyer's closing on me. When I'm doing a sub-sim and a destroyer's found me, I go to periscope depth and I fire all the torpedoes I have at him. I want to hit him. I want to run him down the throat. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. That's not a submarine commander. A submarine commander is an assassin. A sub-commander is an assassin. He goes and hides in a dark place, waits for the target to go by, slits his throat at night, and never utters a murmur. You never even know he's there. That's the kind of person you want commanding a submarine. That's how submarines work. Fighter pilots, on the other hand, have to be aggressive, because if you're not aggressive, look, there are two modes in a dogfight, right? If you're in a dogfight, you are either shooting somebody else down or you're getting shot down by somebody else. Pretty much it. And so aggression in a fighter pilot is life. Aggression is life. Instead of being somebody who's so worried about what the enemy's doing to him, he's got to be worried about that, obviously, as part of his situational awareness. But the guy has to go on the offense, and sometimes he has to go on the offense against multiple bandits. And if he can stay that aggressive, he will actually stay alive. Because now, instead of it being like, my God, what is this guy doing to me? It's like, what am I doing to this other guy? And that's how you stay alive as a fighter pilot. That aggression and that, I don't want to call it recklessness, but it's damn near recklessness, comes from a place of discipline. And it comes from a place of great emotional calm. These guys don't go in there screaming at the top of their lungs with their hair on fire. They go in cold. That's not to say that their heart's not pounding. It's not to say that there's not adrenaline. I've heard the splash kills guys on these guys. They're full of adrenaline. That's not really what I'm talking about. If you look at the great fighter aces, especially World War I, when they were inventing this, you've got Richthofen, and Richthofen basically said, I don't want you in a fair fight, and I surely don't want you taking on guys one-on-one. Your job is to hang up there in the sun, and when you see a straggler or a guy who can't fly, go down and shoot him down. That's what Richthofen did. That's how he got his 80 kills. He just picked off the weak and the new. And he kept living to fly another day. And Ernst Udet, who developed most of these fighter pilot mantras, the things that became axioms, was constantly talking about how we don't want a fair fight. We want, I forget what the number is, but I know what it was in World War II. It was something shocking, really shocking. And somebody's going to know, but I don't know. But it's something like 80 or 85% of all the aircraft shot down in World War II did not know that there was another airplane in the vicinity until they were on fire. In other words, almost all of them were ambushes. Almost all of them. You know, bombers going down or transports going down. It's incredible because they're on the offensive. And if you're going to take on 5 other enemy airplanes, you better be confident that you can stay aggressive enough to shoot down the one, then it's 4-1, then you shoot down another one, now it's 3-1, shoot down the third guy, now it's 2-1, and you shoot down the other guy, now it's an even fight, and the odds just get better and better and better for you. But that's aggression. That's just raw aggression, and it's a kind of a nutty bulldog kind of thing where it's like, you have 15 dogs trying to bite your tail. It's like, no, I want to bite all their tails. Confidence. Sometimes people are overconfident. Those fighter pilots don't live that long. Anyway, I'm just using this as an example for story, for Michael's question about the power of story, because it's easy to tell a weak story. It's much harder to tell a difficult story, and the more you know, the better it is. I think we'll probably end it on this, and we'll do part 2 next time. I did a lot of role-playing games. You know, I did Traveler, played a lot of Traveler. I played a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons, but not much. But I played a lot of Traveler. This is going to make sense in a minute. When you roll a character, you play a character in a role-playing game. And you basically determine your character by a roll of the dice. And there's always a lot of, I won't say cheating, but fudging is probably a better word, because you don't want to have characters that are, useless. So you want a guy with like an intelligence of 20 out of a scale of 20, and he's got his, constitution or his health or whatever is 3. You don't want to do that because, like I said, when you're writing your own hero, you want the hero to be victorious. So in a role-playing game, you want your guy to have 20s on everything. You want him to have 20s on everything. Then you'll be awesome and powerful. But that's not interesting because you'll succeed all the time. And what the designers of several role-playing games said was, if you let the dice do most of the work, it'll be paid off in the end. For example, let's say your character had to have a certain amount of intelligence. Let's just say it's on a scale of 1 to 20. And you wanted a character who had to have a certain amount of intelligence. If you got a guy who comes out with 3 intelligence, you just throw that character away and do it again, because he has to have the intelligence. But what these guys were basically saying is this. If, on the other hand, you got a science officer who needs a high level of intelligence, if you roll a 20 of intelligence, or an 18 or 17 or 19 or something you can get comfortable with, and then you roll a health that's 3, think about what that person would look like. And think about how interesting that is. Then you get into a guy like the guy, the villain in Unbreakable. You got a guy who's very smart but very weak, physically weak. What kind of challenges does that pose to him? How can he overcome these challenges using his intellect? It's interesting. These conflicts are interesting. If you got a guy who's got very high intelligence but very low education, what does that tell you? If you got a guy who's very high education, very low intelligence, what does that tell you? it starts, the randomness of the dice roll starts providing you with grist that you can use. It's interesting. It's different. I got a guy who's got a very high IQ, and he's got a lot of physical ability, and his agility is good. He's very agile. He can jump and run and land on things, but his dexterity is very low. He's got like 2. He's a Butterfingers. He's the kind of guy who can run and jump and land on a dime on a platform, you know, and just be a living, walking death bot, and then he goes to reload his rifle, and he drops the magazine every time. It's interesting. It's cool. So that's all I'm really trying to say about this. The essence of the story is the character, and the essence of the character is the dichotomy and the interest. So anyway, I think that'll do it for the show.